Hello everyone and welcome. Today we're going to be looking at the Resident Evil 4 Remake Chainsaw demo. I'm going to be going over my thoughts about the game's graphics, presentation, some problems I've noticed, and how it compares to previous games also utilizing Capcom's in-house RE engine. And I'm going to be going over the game settings to see which settings are worth the performance cost for the visual gain. So, first things first. This demo, in my opinion, was just absolutely phenomenal. Any doubts I may have had about the game, if I had any left, was instantly gone as soon as I enjoyed this demo. We've seen bigger slices of the game from the footage that Capcom has released, and from what we can see, it is a very faithful remake where most of the iconic spots in the game are recreated very accurately and expanded as were needed. I don't think we're going to be seeing any huge changes from the original, like the Nest 2 area in Resident Evil 3 Remake. But that's not what we're gonna focus on here. I'll leave that for when the full game releases. But how is the demo on a technical level? When I first booted up the demo on my stream, the game was very heavy. Initially, Capcom only announced the game for the current gen consoles, the PS5 and the Series X. So there was some excitement there because the game wouldn't be held back by having to run on the PS4 and the Xbox One. But later, Capcom did announce a PS4 version. But even then, this game feels like a proper current-gen game, and the graphics settings support that. There's a lot more settings to adjust, although there's a few cuts too. But is it heavy because it's a good-looking game, or is it just, quote-unquote, unoptimized? So let's take a look at each graphics settings and see what it does, and boy do we have a lot to go through. There's like close to 30 settings we can adjust. Now, before we dive in, I want to say something about what we can expect from the demo and from the full game. I will address parts of it that are relevant as the video goes on, but by and large, the demos have always been almost a perfect match to the full game feature-wise in the past RE games. There are some bugs that I do hope will be fixed in the full game, but I don't expect it to have any features not present in the demo. The first thing is resolution. So why do I want to talk about the resolution? Isn't that kind of obvious? Well, there's one quality of life change with the resolution setting that has plagued the previous Resident Evil games that has been fixed. It's that when you're trying to adjust the resolution in the previous games, as soon as you cycle through a resolution, the game immediately applies it, even though it might not be the one that you want. But now, you cycle through the resolution and the game only applies the resolution when you leave the resolution setting. It wasn't much of a problem on borderless, but if you were on full screen, you would have to see your monitor flicker every time you switch the resolution, and it was just annoying. So props to Capcom for fixing this. Now, let's get on to the meat and potatoes of the settings. Ray tracing. In Village and all the previous titles that were updated to include ray tracing, it came in two forms, global illumination and reflections. Ray trace reflections are pretty straightforward. Instead of relying on techniques that deliver imperfect results like cube maps and screen space reflections, ray trace reflections traces rays in the world to produce accurate reflections. Now, when it was first implemented in RE Village, it was criticized for not being of good enough quality, running as low as possibly 1/8 or 1/4 resolution. Now, in this demo, after investigating for a while, I just cannot tell how good the quality of the ray trace reflections are, because all the reflective surfaces that I found so far are just murky puddles. There aren't any large bodies of water or any stainless steel. I can kind of make off-screen things appear just enough that there is ray trace reflections, but not enough to tell the quality. Like at the top of the screen there, you can kind of see a piece of wood and some buckets and other equipment, but there seems to be limits to its accuracy, especially in regards to distance. So I went and turned off ray tracing, and to my surprise, this puddle reflected the light from the house through the window. Although it was a little bit too much, but you can tell it's screen space reflections, and when I move the camera down, it falls down to cube map reflections as expected. But it got me thinking, why is this window and the light not reflected in the ray trace mode? I know for a fact that in Village, the ray trace reflections definitely reflect light sources, at least as a glowy particle effect. So I booted up Village, found the nearest body of water with lights, and tested this area. And I found this torch as an example of a light source that's sometimes reflected and sometimes not, based on distance. So I tried to figure out exactly when it disappears and reappears, and turned RT on and off to see if the distance is the same, and it is. At the exact same distance, this torch disappears from both the RT and the RT off reflections. The ripples in the water kind of make it hard to see, but it definitely was the exact same distance. So back to RE4, it seems as if the ray trace reflections just aren't considering sources that are too far away from the player, or the reflection, or it's just not considering certain types of objects for reflections. The most obvious example is when this poor dude gets burned. You can't see any of it being reflected in this puddle. On the smaller puddle, you can see some yellow as if something is being reflected. Possibly because it's closer. We're gonna need to wait for the full game to release so we can test the reflections with some larger bodies of water or just better reflective surfaces. Okay, so that's reflections, but what about global illumination? Unfortunately, it seems like Capcom has cut ray trace global illumination from this game. There's only one setting for ray tracing and the example picture seems to only show reflections. And this is the most obvious example I've found. Ray trace GI tends to have the biggest effect on dynamic objects. That is, objects that can move and has to be dynamically lit. This door looks a little bit too bright, but the bigger example is the barrel. Now this barrel is being lit by the candles on the right, and it is, but you can see it's illuminated a little bit too much on its left side, where the light from the candle shouldn't reach. It should be dark like the rest of the corner. This is in contrast to Village, where you can see these vases having some nice indirect lighting, but if you turn ray tracing off, they become more uniformly lit, like the barrel in RE4. I'm disappointed that Capcom cut such an important effect, but maybe they just have enough faith in the standard lighting that they think ray trace GI is not necessary. We've seen other games cut ray tracing before, like Modern Warfare 2. It has no ray tracing despite the last 3 Call of Duty games having it. So with only ray trace reflections remaining, how is performance? I decided to use this puddle to test the performance because it seems it's as good as any other. You can barely make out the barrel in the reflection. So at the very least, RT reflections seem to cost almost nothing extra in comparison to screen space reflections. However, if you do turn screen space reflections off, there is some gains to be made, as in this scene, while the FPS is fluctuating, there's roughly a 9% performance increase. So should you turn it on? My thinking is probably if it behaves the same as it did in Village, which it seems to. The distance at which some things are reflected is a little bit of a concern. And if you're on an older GPU and you're looking to clawback performance, turning off screen space reflections is a good idea. There's another consideration, which is VRAM usage. It's a little bit tricky to measure, so I'm gonna go over my methodology. I'm using MSI Afterburner here, and there's 2 measurements, memory usage and memory usage for the process. And from what I can tell, the first measurement seems to be total system level VRAM usage, and the second number is for the process, which is the game. Now here's the thing that makes it tricky. When I first start the game, the delta between the 2 numbers is about 1.5 gigabytes, assuming that's roughly how much is taken up by Windows and other stuff. Now as I play through the game longer and longer, the difference between the 2 numbers increases. My assumption is that as time goes on and the game requests and releases memory as needed, Windows doesn't deallocate the memory from the game immediately, so some extra memory stays committed to the game but not actively being used by the process. To further complicate matters, the game also doesn't seem to bother releasing memory it has done using very often. But remember, I'm doing these tests on my 4090. I imagine on GPUs with lower amounts of VRAM it does it more often. It's fairly standard for garbage collectors, so even in the usage number, it would be holding on to some memory that is not actively being used by the game, based on when was the last time the game decided to release some memory. So it's extremely hard to actually measure VRAM usage. But I think I figured out a way. In this game and some others I've noticed, you can manually trigger it to release memory by alt-tabbing. For example, here the game says it's using 10.6 gigabytes of VRAM, and the game itself is saying it's using 10.33 gigabytes of VRAM. But if I alt-tab and then go back into the game, you can see that both numbers have dropped by nearly a gigabyte and a half. It seems like it's something programmed into the game so that when somebody alt-tabs out of the game to do something else, it gives the other applications some breathing room, like the browser or Discord. Now this is why it's always tricky to measure total VRAM usage, because you can never know if the game is just holding onto memory that it's not actively using at any one point in time. But I believe this method is perfectly fine for measuring VRAM usage differences between settings. It's especially important here because you can't turn the ray tracing on and off while the game is running. You have to start a completely new game. So when you arrive at the spot where you want to test it, your VRAM usage is actually wildly different in between runs. But at least if you tell the game to release any extra memory it might be holding on to, the differences should be more accurate. So with this method, I've found that there's roughly a 900 megabytes of extra VRAM usage with RT on at 4K. The game setting itself estimates about 1.3 gigabytes extra. And if you turn screen space reflections off, there's an extra savings of about 200 megabytes. Personally, while I'm very disappointed with the RT, I'm going to keep an eye on for myself as it seems to cost very little performance. But if you're on a GPU with lower amounts of VRAM relative to its performance, like at 3070, it might be a good idea to drop it. It's also possible that in the full game during scenes with large bodies of water, there will be a much bigger performance hit. Now, I want to look at hair strands. It's probably the biggest update to the graphics. And my god, does it look good in cutscenes. Only Leon seems to get it, not the enemies or Hunnigan. But during gameplay there's problems with it. Every so often, for some reason, there's artifacts in the hair. Specifically, these horizontal lines. They're extremely faint at 4K, but if you look close you can definitely see them. And in different situations they seem to become more prominent. Even on cutscenes you can briefly see the artifacts appearing. I kinda sound like that I'm nitpicking, but if I turn the resolution down to 1080p, oh my god, look at that. You might be able to ignore the artifacting at 4K and it's not on all the time, but performance wise it is possibly the most costly setting in the game. Going from high to normal gives a tiny performance boost, maybe a 1 to 2%. But turning it off entirely gives a whopping 30% performance gain. During cutscenes the performance difference is still there, although it seems to depend on whether or not you're looking at the back of Leon's head, as that seems to be where most of the strands are. Plus I seem to have some CPU bottlenecking. And when the cutscene shifts to a scene without any hair strands, the performance seems to be nearly identical. This setting is very visually impactful, but the performance cost just doesn't seem worth it, especially since the regular hair looks really good still. Considering the artifacting and the performance, I'd recommend keeping it off. Now, let's take a look at the texture quality setting. RE Engine games have always been a little bit misunderstood for how much VRAM it eats up, specifically because of this setting and the estimate on the right. Even the 4-year-old RE2 Remake claims that it'll eat up over 12GB of VRAM. The assumption is that this setting is more like a texture pool setting, like most other modern games, and that the engine, depending on how much size is available, will load up whatever textures it thinks is a priority. And it makes sense because if you actually look at the setting, it goes from settings that are all labeled as high, that say it's 8GB, 6, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0.5, and 0.25. This was same in the previous games. But the curious thing is if you go lower, then it says 0.5GB medium and also 0.25GB medium. So you have two of the same setting, just labeled medium and high. So what's the difference? Maybe on the medium setting you set the texture pool to those sizes, but the game will never try to load the highest quality textures and will only load medium textures. And there's also the low setting, which is supposedly 0GB. So I set to figure out how it works. And as far as I can tell, in the areas of the demo there's very little if no visible degradation in texture quality happening at as low as the 3GB setting. All textures look the same as the 8GB. There's very little visible pop-in. I tried rapidly moving around as fast as possible to induce pop-in as I'd expect the game to not load textures as ahead of time as the 8GB setting, but it held on very well. It should be noted that while I was experimenting, changing the setting on the fly did give some weird results. Sometimes smaller textures would degrade and not recover, so I would mistakenly think I found a degraded texture on the 3GB setting. But then when I run through the game again, the same texture would be loaded in when I arrive at the scene. So I made sure to do all the testing for this setting on full runs, which made setting up identical shots harder. Also, there's this weird instance where even on the 8GB setting, these two textures would not load in when I first entered the room, even on the 8GB setting. But then if I go into the next room, do the cutscene and then come back, suddenly they're loaded in. Seemingly by triggering the game's progression, the game maybe unloads some assets so it has some space for that asset now, but you would expect the 8GB setting to not have any problems with that. And this behavior was exactly the same with the 3GB setting. So as far as I can tell, there's still no differences between 8GB and 3GB. And this was reproducible every single time. I thought I was going crazy. Maybe I had set the setting too low on some runs, but I made sure to triple check this. It was with the 2GB setting that I was able to see the first indication of any changes happening. The 2GB setting still does retain the highest quality textures on most surfaces, but you can see some pop-in happening like the cabinet in the background. And also this dirt pile permanently stays slightly degraded. And doing the same desk does not change anything, those two textures always stay lower quality, in addition to the dirt pile. One other thing that I noticed that I wasn't really expecting was on characters. You can see Leon looks absolutely identical between the 2GB and 3GB settings. In this cutscene, Hannigan's textures are degraded. It's especially noticeable around her jacket. I mean, look at that buttonhole. This cutscene seems to have pop-in regardless of your setting, but there's absolutely no degradation on El Salvador. So it seems like it's only Hannigan that got the shaft. But overall, 2GB still looked really good. So what about the 0.5GB settings? Well, on high, I went in here and I immediately saw the dirt pile degrade right in front of me. From my testing, the 0.5GB high setting is highly unstable. The engine keeps repeatedly trying to load in some higher quality textures but then immediately end up degrading them later, resulting in a lot of flickering between different qualities. Here you can see the ground kind of freaking out. And then here you can see the door frame also freaking out. 0.5GB is just not enough to keep high quality textures loaded in for any meaningful amount of time. It does have its use in somewhat limited situations, like when you get a close-up on this keyhole, you'll see that it loads in high quality textures. So what about the 0.5GB medium setting? Well, it's a lot better, at least in terms of stability. It doesn't seem to be trying to load the highest quality textures, as you can see in the keyhole, although you can see some popping on the piece of fabric on the left, but it doesn't seem to try to go for the maximum quality, which makes it way more stable. There's no flickering in between two different qualities on textures. I mean, just look at what the floor is doing here on the high setting. But on the medium setting, it's way more stable. You see some rocks popping on the right, but that's it. Again, there's some limited situations where the high setting will produce better quality, like on this door in this cutscene. One thing I do want to note is texture quality on characters. Hannigan looks identical, but she also looks identical to her 2GB textures. Leon does retain higher quality textures. On the high 0.5GB setting, in fact, it's identical to his max textures. And El Salvador does retain his max quality textures on the high setting. So you do sometimes get better textures on the high 0.5GB settings at the cost of increased instability. Okay, so what about VRAM usage? Well, I tested the 8GB, 3GB, 2GB, and both 0.5GB settings. And I tested them by starting a new game, running to this spot without alt tabbing, and then taking note of the number before and after I had alt tabbed, and here are the results. The 8GB setting was consuming 11.6GB, and then when I alt tabbed it dropped down to about 9. The 3GB setting was using almost 10GB, but when I alt tabbed it dropped down to 8. The 2GB setting was using about 9.1GB, when I alt tabbed it dropped down to around 7.3. The high 0.5GB setting was using about 7.7GB, but when I alt tabbed it dropped down to around 6. And lastly, the medium 0.5GB setting was using about 7.7GB, but when I alt tabbed it dropped to around 5.8. So what conclusions can we draw from this? Well, if you don't do the alt tab method, it would seem you could save 1.6GB of VRAM by going from the 8GB to the 3GB setting, and a further 900MB by going down to the 2GB setting. But with the alt tab method, the savings are shown to be not as big. The first step only saves us 1GB and the second step only saves us 700MB. Plus, this is only a single spot where I tested, but I consider it a good spot to test because it's as much of the game I can go through that is still consistent start to end. But I expect the full game to differ as it will have more demanding areas. So at the very least, if my assessment that the 3GB setting has very little if no visual degradation in quality, then there may be about 1GB you can save by using the 3GB setting. And any further you start taking hits to quality. 2GB you can probably use it without noticing too much quality loss, and I don't think anyone should be using the 0.5GB high setting. The 0.5GB medium setting is far better, as for the low setting, which you're seeing on screen right now, it seems like it locks every texture to the lowest possible quality and doesn't try to load in any higher quality versions, so there's no flickering or pop-in. But the game's minimum system requirements do ask for 4GB GPUs, and the only GPUs that I can think of that can play this game, that I can think of with very low amounts of VRAM, are maybe the 2GB GTX 960 or the 3GB version of the 1060. This game is DirectX 12 only, so I don't think you'll have much luck going even older than that. I think if your GPU is capable of running this game at all, even at like 720p 30fps, you should still be able to swing the 0.5GB medium setting. Okay, so that was a lot to cover, and I could have done more testing, but we need to move on. The next setting I want to look at is the mesh quality setting. The mesh quality setting controls the LOD distance for objects. So when I started experimenting with it, I had trouble figuring out why it was being weirdly inconsistent. But it turns out the setting is permanent on startup. Changing it mid-game doesn't do anything. It'll just keep the old one unless you restart the game. So after a bit of frustration, I tried to figure out what distance do objects start popping in. And here you can see on low with these rocks, you have to get pretty close to get the full detail model. And just by running around, you can see lot transitions in a lot of places, especially around rocks and houses. But when you're in interiors, not a lot of objects seem to respect this setting. Now I didn't test this setting extensively, only between low and max, and for most of the demo I couldn't measure any meaningful performance differences, presumably because of the type of objects that are changing quality, like rocks and some houses probably aren't that demanding compared to the characters' effects and the interior stuff that the game has to render anyway. And I couldn't find any performance differences between low and max, so I went to the village area, which I didn't want to do because of the highly variable nature of the area, and I looked at the house the cow was in and I managed to measure a 1 to 2 FPS difference. But given how visually impactful this setting is, just keep it on max, almost no matter what. Now next is the various shadow settings, and there's 5 settings that are interrelated. The shadow quality, shadow cache, contact shadows, ambient occlusion, and new to this game what Capcom is calling resource intense lighting quality. And I want to talk about this one first. The lighting in RE games, like most games, have been baked. It allows for games to look like it has a lot of light sources and have extremely good looking lighting quality, but the illusion breaks down if scrutinized closely. There are no less than 14 light sources in the main RPD lobby, but those have already made most of their contribution to the lighting in the baking, and during gameplay, depending on how the devs set up them, considering performance costs, they can light dynamic objects but not cast shadows or flat out do nothing. Lighting is just very expensive and you can't have over a dozen dynamic lights overlapping each other without ray tracing. The new setting seems to promise that more lights will cast shadows, and it does, however it doesn't cover everything. It gets these lanterns to cast shadows, but most of the candles don't seem to do anything. These candles on the wall do receive an upgrade, but a lot of the candles on the ground doesn't. Performance-wise, in this example which seems as good as any, there seems to be about a 10% performance difference between the two. So this is a moderately costly setting that might be worth turning down, although I expect this difference to only manifest itself in areas where there are lights that receive the ability to cast shadows. Now, before we move on to the shadow quality, can I just say, I don't know how Capcom is doing this without ray tracing, but this shadow was just beautiful. The way it goes softer and blurrier while Leon is moving further away from the light source is just really good. But onto the shadows. Sadly, this game still has the dithered shadows that the RE engine has always produced. Here is the most obvious. You can see around the edges there's heavy dithering that goes fizzy and is kind of distracting, especially if there's camera sway from Leon. This is mostly cleaned up by the TAA, and while you are far away from most shadows you can't see it, and the shadows overall do look really good, but if you look closely you can definitely see these. The shadow quality setting itself though, it seems to control the resolution of the shadow map as expected, and on low you can see the stair skipping effect on the edge of the shadow, and on medium the effect is decreased, and on high it's mostly gone. And the max quality looks very smooth. On the performance front, I couldn't reliably measure much performance difference with just Leon, so I set up this scene where I put all 3 Ganados so they'd be casting shadows in addition to Leon and tested the settings. Going from max to high seems to have the most gains with a 3% gain to FPS, but going to medium was basically a margin of error, and going to low gave an extra 1 to 2%. I was surprised at the minimal difference, so I asked my friend with a 3060 to test it, and her results were roughly similar to mine, with the biggest gains being made from going from max to high, and going to mid and low had lesser gains but more than what I had. I think the reason is that the shadows have a compute cost and a memory bandwidth cost. And if you're not memory bandwidth limited like on a 4090, the savings in compute isn't much when going down to mid and low because the shadow maps are already pretty low resolution at that point. But if you are bandwidth limited, the savings are a little bit greater. Or it could be something else. On the VRAM usage front, I measured about a 9.8GB usage on this scene on max. And going down to high, there was a nearly 900MB drop. But going down to medium, there was only a 100MB drop. And going down to low was only another 100MB. So it seems to me the best gains are to be made both in performance and VRAM usage when going from max to high. If you're looking to make a cut, that's what I recommend because the high shadows still look really good. Okay, so what about shadow caching? It's a setting that caches shadows that aren't moving from dynamic objects, so the engine doesn't have to calculate it every frame like on the enemies here. And it works very well. Turning it off saves about 500MB of VRAM for me in this scene, but it drops performance by 25%. And from my previous experience with the RE games, you should always have this on. Now for ambient occlusion, since we lack ray trace GI, we need it, and we get the same options as Village, SSAO, and Fidelity FX Cacao. It darkens some areas by approximating occlusion from ambient light that's supposed to have bounced around by a lot. And on these books, you can see that with each setting, the books that are not seen by the lantern are darker, with the CACAO bringing the most dramatic effect. And on the performance front, going from off to SSAO to CACAO seems to incur roughly a 2% cost each. I'd still recommend CACAO as it's a lot better quality than SSAO or off, but if you're looking to make a cut, you wouldn't be losing much for 4%. Now on to contact shadows. Contact shadows seems to be a screen space method for approximating more shadows, while ambient occlusion deals with light occlusion from the ambient light. Contact shadows deals with self-shadowing from lighting. It's a pretty good looking effect for a minor performance cost, within margin of error. I'd recommend you keep it on. And that's all the shadow settings done. Okay, so terrain. According to the tooltip, it tessellates the terrain to enhance it, but I don't know what to make of this setting. On the areas where it's doing something, it's definitely different. Instead of large parts of the terrain being flat, there's more ridges, and you could say it arguably looks better. And you can see these rocks look more exposed because the dirt around them is more uneven. Performance-wise, there seems to be nearly a 5% gain in turning it off. My recommendation is that it looks nice, but I don't think anyone will miss it if they turned it off. The next setting is volumetric lighting, and I expected it to be more interesting, but in the demo I could only find one solid source of volumetric lighting. And from testing the various settings, on minimum, which is a setting lower than low, you can see that the rays are very incoherent and stair skip pretty heavily when there's motion on the camera. On low there's some improvement, although very little. On medium they start to look passable for stable. And on high it's completely smooth, very hard to see any breakup, although there might be some edge cases. On max it looks mostly the same, although the edges of the rays look a little bit smoother. Performance wise, going from max to high gave about a 4% performance boost, and going from high to mid potentially gave a 1% boost, although it's within margin of error. And going from mid to low didn't seem to do much, same as going down to min, and completely turning it off seemed to give around 2%. The next setting I want to look at is depth of field. Thankfully, it doesn't seem to engage at all during regular gameplay. It only activates during cutscenes or what I'd like to call cinematic events like grabs, getting stabbed, parrying the chainsaw. In this cutscene, having depth of field off seems to gain about 2 to 3% performance. And it's very hard for me to test the performance differences between cinematic events, but it doesn't seem to matter because the performance differences stay even when there's no depth of field happening. I thought Leon's back might have been getting some depth of field, but no, I don't think that's the case. This is in contrast to motion blur where with just the setting changed but no motion blur on screen, the performance is identical. Speaking of motion blur, in this game there seems to be both camera motion blur and per object motion blur. I'm very disappointed as I really dislike camera motion blur, but I really like per object motion blur. But previous RE games seems to have had the same thing and I always played with motion blur on. Performance wise, while I'm spinning it's kinda hard to tell due to the fluctuations, but there's definitely a small gain here, 1 to 2% from turning it off. And about the same here while stabbing the air. And when you stop the stabbing, the performance difference disappears. The last setting I want to cover in detail is the resource intensive effects quality. It's kind of ambiguous. From the picture it seems like it controls some effects that the engine considers resource intensive like footprints on mud. But from what I can tell, the demo doesn't have any places where this setting seems to prevent or allow footprints to be made. Every single spot where I did find footprints were being made, this setting actually didn't seem to matter. They would be made on low anyway. So I thought maybe the setting controls how many can be made, but I don't think that's the case. You can still make plenty of footsteps appear on low. The footsteps disappear after some time, but I don't think the setting affects how long the footsteps remain. And even looking at the scene after a bunch of footprints were made, there doesn't seem to be any performance difference, so I'm probably looking at the wrong place and this setting does control other things. I just haven't found it or they're just not in the demo. So this video is getting pretty long, so let's quickly look over all these settings that I haven't looked over yet. First is subsurface scattering. It makes skin look more realistic by simulating how light disperses into human skin. And in this cutscene there seems to be a decent 5% performance difference between the two. Rain quality. Well, there's no rain in this demo, but we know there will be rain in this area. Bloom. It makes lights have a glowy effect, instead of looking like plastic with yellow paint. Lens flare, J.J. Abrams' favorite effect. But is the game scene meant to be from a camera or an eyeball? Although I should say the lens flare in this game is very minimal. It's restricted to barely the lantern as you can see here. Performance wise, there isn't much savings to be had. Each of them seems to roughly cost about 1%, so turning both off gives about 2%. Particle lighting quality. It seems to affect the quality of the particles or the level of light they can receive. But when I turn the setting to low here, you can see these particles straight up disappear. Even though the setting went from high to low, not off. And performance wise, there doesn't seem to be any difference. Lens distortion. It is my least favorite setting in most games, but I've kept it on for the testing here just for the sake of testing things with max settings. Lens distortion simulates the effect where the lens of the camera fails to properly focus on different light color waves into a single point, leading to a distorted look. Why would anyone want to replicate it is beyond me. Since it's active all the time, I just decided to test it at the start of the game to keep the camera angle as consistent as possible. Going from on with chromatic aberration to just on seems to not do anything, but turning it off definitely seems to have gained about 1%. And lastly, there are some settings that I would say are CPU settings. Graphic dismemberment, persistent corpses, corpse physics, diverse enemy animations, and destructible environments. Now these aren't exactly graphic settings, they're all CPU heavy, and I suspect the reason why they're here in the first place is that they were implemented to get the game running on the PS4's very old CPU. Older RE games, for example, had distant enemies animating at half or quarter rate, and R2 Remake had dismemberment, but R3 Remake didn't. If you're on any sort of modern CPU, you should just keep these on, since RE engine games tend to be not CPU bottlenecked most of the time. And we've made it to the end of the video. That took a while, but thanks for watching if you made it this far into the video. Make sure to follow me on Twitch, I stream almost every day and I'll be running this game when it comes out. Link is in the description. And make sure to like, comment and subscribe, and I'll see you guys on Twitch.